You wake up. You reach for your phone. Before your nervous system has finished booting. Before your prefrontal cortex has assumed operational control. You are already performing. Already signaling. Already transmitting identity data to a network that was designed, long before you arrived, to receive it, classify it, and sell it back to you at a margin. This is not a metaphor. This is the architecture. The most profitable product any system ever sold you was not a commodity. It was not a service. It was not even an experience. It was the definition of who you are without it. The system did not sell you a shoe. It sold you the version of yourself that wears that shoe. It did not sell you a platform. It sold you the social coordinates that platform assigns to your existence. The commodity was always secondary. The identity was always the product. And you paid for it. Not with money, with something far more finite. You paid with the cognitive architecture of your self-concept. You handed over the source code of your own identity and accepted, in return, a leased copy, a version of yourself that runs on their infrastructure, subject to their terms of service, revocable at any update cycle. This is the identity lease, and almost no one reads the contract. In thermodynamics, there is a principle. A system in equilibrium resists change. It will absorb enormous amounts of external energy before it reorganizes. The boardroom understands this. The architect has always understood this. You do not control a population by force. Force is expensive, inefficient, and it generates resistance vectors. You control a population by becoming the reference frame against which they measure themselves. Think about what that means structurally. If the system defines what success looks like, what beauty looks like, what intelligence signals, what belonging requires, then every individual who adopts those definitions has voluntarily integrated the system's logic into their identity layer. They are not being coerced, they are being synchronized. And a synchronized node does not rebel against the network. It believes it needs in order to exist. This is not conspiracy. This is game theory. When the kingmaker controls the definitions, the masses compete according to rules they did not write, toward destinations they did not choose, using metrics they did not design, and they do all of this while experiencing it as personal ambition, as self-expression, as freedom. The elegance of this mechanism is brutal. The most effective cage is one whose bars are made of the prisoner's own desires. And here is where it becomes structurally interesting. The system does not need to tell you who to be. It only needs to make the alternatives feel like social death. It needs to make the cost of opting out feel higher than the cost of compliance. Because a being operating under perceived scarcity, social scarcity, identity scarcity, belonging scarcity, will self-regulate, will self-police, will enforce the system's logic on others without any external instruction. You become the executor of your own containment. The signal propagates. The network stabilizes. The architect collects the delta. Now ask yourself this, and sit with the discomfort of it. If you stripped away every brand, every platform, every institutional signal you have ever used to explain yourself to the world, what coordinates would remain? What would you point to? If the answer requires any infrastructure you did not build, then you are not the owner of your identity. You are its tenant, and somewhere in a boardroom you will never enter, someone is collecting the rent. Somewhere in a boardroom you will never enter, someone is collecting the rent. Let that land, because the rent is not symbolic, the rent is structural. Every time you reach for an external signal to validate an internal state, Every time you need the platform's approval to confirm that your opinion has weight. Every time you need the brand's insignia to confirm that your taste has value. Every time you need the institution's credential to confirm that your intelligence is real, you are making a payment. You are transferring equity from your own identity ledger into theirs. And the transaction is invisible, which is precisely what makes it so efficient. The architect does not want you poor. A poor tenant cannot pay rent. The architect wants you just solvent enough to keep leasing, just confident enough to keep performing, just insecure enough to never stop needing the next renewal cycle. This is not malice. Malice implies emotion. This is engineering. Here is the mechanism at its most precise. When you adopt a system's identity infrastructure, its language, its aesthetics, its hierarchy of signals, you do not merely use it. You become a node that rebroadcasts it. You become a distribution channel for the system's own logic. Every time you enforce its values on someone else, every time you judge another person's choices through the system's framework, every time you police deviation from the norm the boardroom established, you are performing unpaid maintenance on their network. This is what the operator understands that the masses never do. The most valuable labor in any control architecture is not the labor that builds the cage. It is the labor that convinces the other prisoners the cage is a penthouse. And the masses perform this labor voluntarily, enthusiastically. They post it. They share it. They argue for it at dinner tables. They raise their children inside it and call it values. The synchronization is complete when the node can no longer distinguish between the network's signal and its own. When you cannot tell the difference between what you want and what you were configured to want, the lease has become invisible. And an invisible lease is the most binding contract in existence. Because you cannot negotiate terms you do not know you agreed to. So what does the operator do with this information? Not panic. Panic is a low information response, not rejection. Wholesale rejection of all external structure is itself a system. It is the system of contrarianism, which the boardroom has already commodified and is currently selling back to you as rebellion-branded merchandise. The operator runs an audit, cold, systematic, without sentiment. You do not destroy the infrastructure, you map it. You identify which elements of your self-concept are load-bearing, meaning. They would survive the removal of every external validation system, and which elements are purely leased, meaning they dissolve the moment the platform changes its algorithm. The brand loses cultural relevance, or the institution revokes its credential. Load-bearing identity is scarce. Most people have almost none of it. That is not an insult. It is a diagnostic. And a diagnostic is the beginning of leverage. Here is the protocol, 3 directives. Execute them in sequence. First, inventory severance. Conduct a systematic audit of every identity signal you currently use to explain yourself to others or to yourself. And for each one, ask a single question. Does this signal exist if the system that created it ceases to exist? If the answer is no, you have identified a leased asset. Document it. Do not discard it yet, simply see it clearly. Because clarity is the first asymmetric advantage the masses almost never acquire. The operator who knows which of their coordinates are rented can never be fully dispossessed, because they are never surprised by the eviction notice. Second, value source relocation. Begin the deliberate process of anchoring your self-concept to outputs rather than affiliations. An output is something you produced, a capacity you demonstrated, a problem you solved, with no external framework telling you how. Affiliations are borrowed gravity. They make you feel weightful by proximity to something else's mass. Outputs are intrinsic gravity. They are mass you generated yourself. And no algorithm update, no brand collapse, no institutional restructuring can retroactively unmake what you have already built. The operator who builds from outputs rather than affiliations becomes structurally immune to the boardroom's primary lever of control, which is the threat of social dispossession. Third, signal architecture ownership. Design the signals you emit rather than inheriting them. This does not mean fabrication. It means intentionality. It means asking, before you speak, post, affiliate, or display, is this signal serving my architecture, or am I serving the signal's architecture? The architect of any system controls it precisely because they design the signal structure rather than inheriting it from a prior architect. When you begin designing your own signal architecture, even imperfectly, even incrementally, you shift your position in the network from node to designer, from resource to operator. The gap between those two positions is not talent. It is not luck. It is the single decision to stop leasing and start building. The system will not collapse because you read this. The boardroom is not threatened by awareness. It has priced awareness into the model. What it has not fully priced is the compounding effect of individuals who take the audit seriously enough to act on it. Not as a trend, not as an identity in itself, but as a quiet, structural renegotiation of the terms under which they exist. You were handed a lease you did not sign. That is the condition you were born into, but you are not required to renew it. The architect builds, the operator executes with precision. The masses consume the output and call it identity. Which position you occupy is not fixed, it is chosen, repeatedly, in the small decisions that accumulate into the architecture of a life. Choose with the cold clarity of someone who has read the contract. Subscribe to AXIOM Protocol.